David Hockney really has very many connections with the National Gallery that have spanned the last 70 years. He came first as an 18-year-old in 1955 and looked at the wonderful paintings and fell in love with certain of them, including Piero's Baptism of Christ, that he called a real gem. And then he started looking at our paintings for inspiration. And in certain of his paintings, he actually includes National Gallery paintings in the background. Piero della Francesca's Baptism of Christ appears in the background of two of his paintings. One is called My Parents, and the other is looking at pictures on a screen. David Hockney's also been involved in particular exhibitions at the National Gallery at key milestones in our history. In 1977, the National Gallery started a very pioneering series of exhibitions called The Artist's Eye, and David Hockney was invited in 1981 to become the fifth Artist's Eye.
In the context of the National Gallery's 200th anniversary, we've had the opportunity to look at a series of exhibitions that we staged in the past called The Artist's Eye. The National Gallery commissioned contemporary artists of their time to select their favorite paintings from the National Gallery's collection and supplement it by paintings of their own making. David Hockney's Artist's Eye exhibition at the National Gallery was really exciting because he used space in a way that had not been used before. Using digital technologies, we can now reconstruct David Hockney's Artist's Eye exhibition from the summer of 1981.
If we were a visitor coming to David Hockney's Artist's Eye 1981, you'd have ascended the staircase and been in a little foyer area, which was sort of an introduction space to the exhibition space proper. And on the wall in front of you, you actually didn't see a painting at all. You saw a tapestry, a work by Archie Brennan, a tapestry he had made after David Hockney's Play Within a Play that showed his friend John Casmin, the art dealer. He's standing next door to a chair with a tapestry behind him, and this idea of a fictive tapestry with a sort of lovely drape around it, a sort of hem, he lifted actually from a Domenichino fresco here at the National Gallery that was called Apollo Killing Cyclops. He then went into the exhibition room proper. On the left-hand wall, you would have seen David Hockney's painting of 1977 looking at pictures on a screen. He slightly skewed the script that was to bring in a selection of National Gallery paintings into a room. What he did was he brought his own picture centre stage into the room and had a few National Gallery paintings which had featured in his painting alongside. On the far end of the east wall was hanging Vermeer's A Young Woman Standing at a Virginal. And then next door to that was Piero della Francesca's Baptism of Christ. Then there was Vincent van Gogh's Sunflowers. And then there was Degas' After the Bath, Woman Drying Herself. Hockney was certainly drawn to those four artists, and he said in particular he loved Piero della Francesca. He once said he'd never fallen out with Piero. He was also quite pragmatic because he wanted to take reproductions home with him of favourite National Gallery paintings. So he had to buy works which were available. He said that he was a little bit restricted in what posters were then available in colour of the National Gallery paintings. So that did have an effect on what he chose as well. But fortunately, his beloved Piero della Francesca's Baptism of Christ was a poster, as was his favourite Sunflowers. So he was a happy man. Then right ahead of you was the stage set that the original sitter, his friend Henry Geldsal, would have stood in as David Hockney had painted, looking at pictures on the screen. So you actually had a screen, and on that screen were pinned the 4 poster reproductions of the original 4 National Gallery paintings as they were originally in the painting, and they brought back the same chair. So the only element that was missing was Henry Geldzahler, which was quite deliberate because we, the viewer, would then go and stand literally in Geldzahler's shoes and stare at the screen as he was doing, enjoying looking at the pictures.
When we look at the contact sheets of David Hockney's Artist's Eye series, we can get a very, very good understanding of how he arranged images in space. But when we use the digital technology, we can also understand how that spatial arrangement would actually affect the visitor. David Hockney, he really created a stage set in 3 pieces. On the left-hand side, we had his own artwork. On the right-hand side, it was contrasted with the moment of the original. And in the middle, straight ahead of the visitor, what we could see was actually a staging of the process of seeing itself.
So one of the props was this fabric-covered chair. And I think Hockney was very keen on having a model with a chair because, of course, we have that in looking at pictures on a screen where Henry Geldzahler is standing as though perhaps he just stood up from sitting down to take a closer look. And if we look at the tapestry by Archie Brennan, Play Within a Play, we have exactly the same thing. We have a friend, a close friend, in this case John Caslin, standing up with a chair next door to him. And the final element of the room was a postcard framed up in a quite an ornate gilt frame. And this was a postcard after the Weird of his friend Toulouse-Lautrec. And the story behind that was that David Hockney had seen the original painting in a museum in Albi in the south of France, had loved this painting so much. He talks about the sort of red and the yellow costume that the sitter was wearing. And he bought up the whole stack of postcards and he sent them to his friends because he wanted them to get the buzz and the vibration of the original coming through a little colour reproduction.
What is actually quite amusing in the entire exhibition is that the meta levels of engagement with the process of looking are being compounded over and over again. David Hockney bought exhibition reproductions. He pinned them on a screen in his own personal home. He then painted his friend looking at that very screen. Then he brought the screen and the painting in the same room. And then he got his friend to look at the screen that had been painted and was being looked at by us.
Again, this very close looking, this longer look that we're beginning to get in all the different elements of the show was also seen in 2 other aspects of the show. So he designed a very clever poster for the exhibition, which showed himself looking at the pictures on the screens. So he was substituting himself for Henry Geldzahler, encouraging us also to substitute ourselves in the room itself. And then you had to look very carefully at the poster because Vermeer painting or poster was taken away and it was substituted with a poster of looking at pictures on a screen. And then down the bottom of the poster, there were 4 watercolour reproductions by David Hockney of the 4 original paintings. And this play on looking was also continued in the booklet that he wrote to accompany the exhibition, where in the back of the booklet there were 8 postcards. There were 4 of the original paintings, but there were also 4 details that David Hockney himself had chosen because he wanted people to really look at the paintings and discover where his favourite detail had come from. And I think the titles that he chose for the different elements of his show are very, very telling, and they're quite witty. So everything's around his picture, looking at pictures on a screen. He actually entitled the whole exhibition Looking at Pictures in a Room, and then the booklet he called Looking at Pictures in a Book. So I think He's very wittily encouraging the viewer to think about the many ways in which you can look at art, whether it's the original, whether it's a reproduction, whether that reproduction's on a screen as a poster, in a book, and so on.
The idea of the exhibitions were conceived by the then director of the National Gallery, Michael Levy, and the then exhibition curator, Alistair Smith. They probably didn't expect the extent of range that different artists would have when curating exhibitions. We would have somebody like Lucian Freud or Francis Bacon, who very much curated their own personal selections of taste. And then we have David Hockney, who brings together the original paintings with his very strong and very intellectual interest in reproduction as a source of intelligent viewing and joy.
We know quite a lot about the genesis of the exhibition because there's a lot of extant letters that went between David Hockney and various staff at the National Gallery. We have a rich archive for all of the Artist's Eye series, but there's a lovely rich correspondence, particularly between Hockney and Michael Levy and Alistair Smith. That's very engaging. It's a very warm relationship. There's a little bit of correspondence trying to find out the locations for the props, because of course the screen and the chair were very important. I believe one of them was in New York. The critics were very keen on the exhibition as well, and Michael Levy wrote a very charming, warm-hearted letter to the artist, thanking me very much for his efforts and saying, I think your efforts will allow people to see pictures in new ways, and your booklet has also increased people's understanding of art.
In the 1970s and 1980s, there were several advances of curatorial studies in museums all over the world, and also here at the National Gallery. There was a period in which museums tried to understand what contemporary artists would do with the art of the past. And the National Gallery does so not through art historians and curators, but by engaging artists.
It's amazing the longevity of David Hockney's relationship with the National Gallery. I think is pretty unsurpassed. Hockney has taken National Gallery pictures as a source of inspiration and played around with them and responded to them. So, for example, he's done his own version of Van Gogh's chair, and in another instance, he's taken the dragon that we see in Paolo Uccello's The George and the Dragon, and he put it into the background of his stage set for the Magic Flute. But then the connections with the National Gallery grew deeper in a different way. As we have discussed, Hockney was involved as Artist's Eye number 5. And then the second exhibition was another milestone in the gallery's history. This was for the millennium in 2000. He created 12 likenesses of front of house staff. And the third one marks our bicentenary, 200 years of the National Gallery. It's a small focus exhibition where we've put Piero della Francesca's iconic Baptism of Christ in the centre, surrounded by 2 works by David Hockney, both of which feature Piero's Baptism of Christ in their background, to make a triptych of works which really visualises and summarises this relationship over time between our collection of the past and artists of the present, and how a dialogue can arise when artists speak to each other over time, across centuries, across periods, across schools.